That's really set us up perfectly for the talk. There's no money, apparently, for the NHS. So I'm really looking forward to our talk this afternoon. Our speakers are Prue Plumridge, and she's accompanied by Deborah Harrington, who is also here to answer some questions for us. Prue is co-director of the Gower Institute of Modern Money Studies, and Deborah is co-director of Public Matters, which is an independent research and information partnership. Modern money theory doesn't sound very exciting, but you've all turned up here, which is great. I think it's one of the most exciting things to come out of economics in the last 300 years. I was really bored by economics at A-level, so, but anyway, maybe I'm exaggerating slightly, but anyway, I have read a textbook on modern money theory just this week, and as textbooks go, it was pretty exciting. Anyway, I will stop babbling, and I will let Prue take over. Will you please give Prue and Deborah a very big welcome.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us to speak. The Gower Initiative was set up and launched last October. Now, we are an independent, non-profit organisation, and we're part of an international movement that is currently challenging the economic orthodoxy of the last 4 decades. Now, the first thing to tell you is that we're not academics and we're not economists. But our personal studies have brought us together with an understanding that the dominant economics of our day is deeply flawed. Now, the last 9 years of austerity provide the evidence of how government spending decisions and policies can affect our lives in all sorts of ways. Now, over time, we have witnessed increases in poverty and inequality, seen the growth of food banks and homelessness, watched as public health has suffered under the burden of spending cuts, borne the consequences of the running down of our public and social infrastructure, and we stood by as our public assets have been sold off or privatised. It is the culmination of 40 years of an ideological agenda. Now, as David Stuckler writes, author of The Body Economic Why Austerity Kills, it stems from the belief that small government and free markets are always better than state intervention. It is a socially constructed myth, a convenient belief amongst politicians taken advantage of by those who have a vested interest in shrinking the role of the state, in privatising social welfare systems for personal gain. So when anyone brings up the subject of economics, it's usually accompanied with a bit of a glazed look in the eye of the listener. Now, it's pretty much seen as an arcane subject having very little to do with our lives, the lives of real people, and yet the reality is it has everything to do with our lives. Economics and indeed politics are about us, Now, following the 2010 election, we were told that due to financial mismanagement by the previous government, there was no alternative to public sector spending cuts, as we could no longer afford to pay for our public services. Our money system was compared to a credit card, and it was said that bankruptcy was just around that corner if we did not get our finances under control. They even compared us to Greece. Now, the economic ideology which has informed our politicians, institutions, and even the media for so long has been underpinned by a false understanding of how money works. So our aim today is to unpick that fiction. which has been used to justify austerity and cuts to public sector spending, demonstrate how a better understanding of how money really works can offer a lens on the art of the economic possible and show what the real constraints to public spending are. Now, it is really important to note that both sides of the political spectrum have adhered for decades to a false narrative of how money works. And the argument at election time has often revolved around who was the most fiscally prudent, who was reckless with the public money, or indeed who will deliver a fiscally sound programme in the future if they are elected. Now, it's our view that a good economic system, rather than fixating on the state of the public accounts in terms of deficit and debt as a measure of economic competency, should be considering instead the effects of government policy on a nation, the economy and its citizens. Essentially, it should be evaluating a government's real economic record. Who gained and who lost out as a result of government policies and its taxing and spending decisions, not whether it balanced the budget. However, let's imagine for a moment that an election has been called. And each party sets out its manifesto. Let's then imagine that one of those parties, or it might be both of those parties, presents a substantial spending programme to deliver their agenda. Now, what do you think will be the next question from other politicians, financial institutions, journalists, and most probably the public? Anybody got any ideas what the next question's going to be? How we're going to pay for it, you've guessed it. Now, for decades, the public has been seduced by an idea of how money works. Now, we can call it the household budget model. And Margaret Thatcher, in a speech to the Conservative Party in 1983, promoted this model when she said, "We know there is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money." So in the same way that for centuries people believed that the sun went round the earth until Copernicus, a little bit unwisely for him, challenged the religious authorities, so the orthodox model of household budgets has held sway in people's minds, and it's been accepted as a universal truth. Deficit and debt have become public enemy number one. So just as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz uncovers the reality of just a man behind the curtain, we will aim today to expose the arcane world of the mainstream economists who forgot to incorporate the real world in real time into their impenetrable equations and modelling. Now, modern monetary theory, or as I prefer to call it, modern monetary reality, basically invites us to suspend, just for a moment, what we think we know. It comprehensively challenges the prevalent public understanding of how money works. So let's start right at the very beginning. Modern monetary reality is not something that can be adopted by government or implemented at a future date. It's not equivalent to policy, and neither is it situated on the right or the left of the political spectrum. In simple terms, it's a description of how money system works right here, right now, today. Now, it has a body of work. It has its roots in the work of 19th century chartism and in the early 20th century work of John Maynard Keynes, but has over decades been developed further by a variety of heterodox economists, culminating in the formalisation as a coherent description of how money works in a post-gold standard era. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But I want to emphasise that we don't have to be economists to grasp the essentials of MMT, nor to be able to take the next step in understanding how it could build a better society for all. So essentially, in a nutshell, it challenges two prevalent ideas: that the government doesn't have any money of its own, and that unemployment is necessary to keep inflation down. It then goes on to answer the perennial question, how will you pay for it? It shows what the real constraints to government spending are, and demonstrates that unemployment is a government choice and not something determined by the markets. I said I'd come back to the gold standard, and it's important in MMT to know a little bit about the gold standard and the Bretton Woods system of international payments, which collapsed in 1971. Before 1971, although sterling was not directly convertible into gold, the value of the pound was fixed against the US dollar, which was convertible. As such, this system meant that the UK's policy options were constrained, meaning that the number of pounds in circulation were restricted by the amount of gold and dollar stocks held by the government. And this further meant that the money supply had to be more or less static, which then again, as I said, had implications for government spending policies. So when Bretton Woods collapsed, the pound was no longer pegged to the dollar, and sterling became a fiat currency, which was not backed by a commodity like gold or tied to a foreign currency. For any of you who know a little bit about Latin, the word fiat is Latin for let it be done. And what that means, quite simply, is that the currency is legislated into existence. The pound in your pocket is quite simply an IOU, a promise to pay the bearer on demand. So if I go to the bank and I hand over my £5 note, what am I going to get? Another £5 note. Money represents a social unit of account. It can be a record of credit or debit, and its use and value are based on the issuing authority, not on any intrinsic value or worth. So under this system, the policy limitations that arose from the gold standard and fixed exchange rates no longer applied. However, the politicians, the economists, and the institutions, and the journalists carried on behaving as if nothing had changed, and the illusions about how the state money system works persists right up till today. Now, the debate is framed in simple metaphors which we can all identify: our own household budgets. So this leads us to believe that governments are just like us and can only spend what they can tax or borrow. And the common political tropes on the right of the political spectrum, such as we need to tighten our belts and balance the books, or we must pay our way in the world, are quite simply reinforcements of a framework that no longer applies. Indeed, only this week, Sajid Javid, the current Chancellor, said of Labour's spending plans, not only did they reject the treatment, meaning austerity, that needed to heal our economy and get the deficit down by 4/5, they now want to take every step imaginable to make the country sick and unhealthy again. And at the same time, they've rushed to cancel austerity and announce their own public spending programme, whilst capping it at 3% of GDP, so household budgets reign. But I have to say to you that such household budget narratives are not confined to the political right on the political left, the same beliefs predominate about how money works. So we've had the Green Party, for example, which has just announced that it will borrow over 100 billion over the next decade to rid the UK of fossil fuels. And only last year, at an event that Gims was present at, the Shadow Chancellor got a huge round of applause for saying that he was going to bring the magic money tree back from the Cayman Islands to pay for public services. You know, modern monetary reality in that sense is trumped by people's sense of fairness, which of course is sound, but it does not reflect the way we actually pay for our services, by a politically derived choice to spend money, which in reality, and as we come to shortly, is not based on what is financially affordable or the state of the public accounts. Across the political spectrum, politicians persist in repeating these false economic narratives, and as such, any meaningful debate is stifled, and we simply carry on with the status quo. So we need to challenge this narrative and the associated language that underpins it. So if we want to start with the basics, what do we mean by a monetarily sovereign country? Now, these are countries that issue their own currency, which floats freely on international markets, impose a tax regime in that local currency, never borrow in a foreign currency, don't hold significant debt in a foreign currency, or promise to pay it back in that currency. And they're not pegged to another currency like the dollar. Now, such countries which have full monetary sovereignty, which include the UK, the US, and Japan, have a range of economic tools at their disposal which enables them to achieve their domestic goals. Now, these consist of monetary policy, which involves using interest rates to influence levels of consumer spending, or we have fiscal policy, which involves the government changing the levels of taxation and government spending in order to influence aggregate demand and the level of economic activity. Now, as a point of interest here, whilst the former has become the dominant mechanism for achieving economic stability, in more recent years it is showing its limitations, as interest rates currently are at their lowest for years, and some already in the negative, which basically, in the face of economic recession, will leave the central bank no wriggle room to manage the economy effectively. Fiscal policy is increasingly becoming the mot du jour to counteract the prospect of another recession. So in short, a government that is sovereign has no financial constraints preventing it from spending. The government pays for things simply by spending the money into existence. There aren't any magic money trees or printing presses in the basement of the central bank. Quite simply, the central bank creates the money electronically via keystrokes on a computer screen, which then become entries on a balance sheet when they are transferred to the reserve accounts of banks. Now, it's as simple as that. Now, such a government cannot default on its debt repayments or become insolvent, provided that those debts are denominated in the local currency. Now, before we go on, it's probably worth at this point to describe what we actually mean by debt and deficit, and why it actually isn't the bogeyman that it is presented as. Now, I'm sure you all know, but I'll just clarify a couple of points. The deficit is the difference between how much tax the government collects and how much it spends. It's simply another name for the flow of money from the government sector here that created it from nothing by the central bank, which ends up in the non-government sector. Now, the national debt just represents an accumulation of annual deficits over years and is the total stock of money is held in savings at any given time, is quite simply nothing more than a record of the UK pounds the government ever issued to the people, and has no more significance than that. So deficits in themselves are neither good nor bad. Now we should worry less about the size of the deficit and more about its context. Now that might mean looking at the government's response to the inevitable economic cycles. It could also mean asking questions about whether the government spent enough to ensure full employment, or whether it created the public and social infrastructure necessary to deliver public purpose, aimed at ensuring a healthy economy and the well-being of citizens. And the claim by politicians and think tanks is that our children will inherit this terrible debt burden in the future in the form of higher taxes if the government of today fails to deal with its finances now. They also talk about the intergenerational gap and how fewer children will lead to less taxes being paid to fund public services, leading then to talk about pension reform and changes to retirement age. But the reality is that our children and their children will inherit an impoverished future for very different reasons. If the government fails to plan and spend adequately now in order to enable future generations to be as productive as they can be, then that burden will not be a tax burden. It will be one of lower living standards and well-being across the board for all. Not spending enough could also have serious implications for the future in terms of the climate change crisis. On that note, the idea that we cannot right the social injustices, provide decent public services, or even save our species because there is not enough money is a worrying deception. And yet, on the other hand, when it comes to war or bailing out banks, money seems to always be no object. Now, essentially, deficits are normal and necessary. Indeed, you might be surprised to know that we run them continuously, with few exceptions, since the Bank of England was formed in 1694. Now, in all that time, we haven't gone bankrupt, not even after the Second World War, when our national debt stood at 248% of GDP, and the government of the day built social housing, created the social security system, an education service, and our beloved NHS. Now, to give some context here, our national debt stood at approximately 75% of GDP in 2010, just after the global recession, and in 2018 stood at 86%. Now, this suggests, if nothing else, and in the light of the debt doomsters who told us in 2010 that bankruptcy was just around the corner if we didn't get our public finances in order, that we might have been just a little bit misled. If nothing else, it should be a moment to ask questions and challenge what we think we know. And again, and I'll keep saying this, we should be focusing on the context, what government spent its money on, what the outcomes were, not whether it increased the deficit or the debt. These are just red herrings. Deficits definitely do matter, but not in the way that we have been led to believe. Now, in this context, it is useful to understand the process by which government runs a deficit. Now, the story goes that governments issue bonds in order to borrow money to help them pay their bills. And then investors, including banks, insurers, and pension funds, they all come along and buy them in order to earn a return, small as it is. Now, the latter is absolutely true, but in reality, the government has no need to issue these bonds to cover its spending. because as we now know, it is the currency issuer. In fact, on a point of logic, nobody could have even purchased a bond before the government had actually spent the money into existence. So in short, we should challenge the notion, at least, that a government is borrowing money through the sale of bonds or securities, because it isn't. And to better describe what the deficit and the debt actually is, perhaps we should call them our savings, or indeed our assets. It represents the public and social infrastructure which a government has spent money on. If you have a private pension or a stash of premium bonds, you hold a part of the so-called national debt or the deficit. Even the £10 in your pocket is part of the national debt. Now, the fact that bonds are issued at all is just quite simply, as we were talking earlier about the gold standard, it's just a throwback to that time when treasury bonds were issued to defend the currency and the supply of gold available to government. At no point in time could such a currency issuing government run out of its own currency, even then, but it could run out of gold to exchange its currency for. Now, it might surprise you to know that these days bond sales are just quite simply the equivalent of our own savings accounts. They can be a nice safe place for pensions and insurance funds, or indeed countries who have earned pounds selling goods to us and want somewhere to store their pounds and earn some interest in the interim. Their function these days is quite simply to allow the central bank to meet its overnight target interest rate. And that's it. And as for the government as the currency issuer, it can always meet those financial liabilities when those bonds or securities mature. In no way do such bond sales constitute borrowing for governments to spend, although on paper it is presented as such. Now, in the same way as borrowing is not funding government's deficit, tax is equally not funding government spending. Now, we pay tax in many different ways, through general taxation or national insurance, or even when the government spends, which initiates a sort of spending chain during which at each stage tax is paid during the selling and buying process. But people often talk about that money going into public coffers. But the currency issuer neither has coffers where it stores it or it needs it to spend. Okay, so I can now hear you thinking, well, if it's true that tax doesn't fund government spending, what happens to it and why am I paying it? Pretty decent question to ask. But in fact, paying your taxes is not optional, it's essential. Now, it might be shocking to learn that when you've paid your taxes, they are quite simply extinguished from existence. In fact, in the US, where they still can pay their taxes in cash, they actually burn it. But once you've paid your tax, it has achieved its objective, and the government doesn't need it anymore. But it still does play a vital role in managing the economy. Now, firstly, it drives the currency and allows the government to provision itself, meaning buying the things it needs in order to function. Essentially, it means that in order to pay our tax, we have to have a job to earn the money in the first place. So basically, it legitimizes the currency and ensures that it is accepted by people when they buy things. In other words, the shopkeeper is not going to accept your shiny buttons in payment for a bar of chocolate. He needs to earn the legitimate currency from you in order to pay his tax obligation. Now, secondly, in this, in the role of taxes, it's one of the mechanisms for controlling inflation. Now, inflation is a really, really complex subject, and I'm not going to go here. We'd be here to about tomorrow morning, I think, if we did. But taxes are a critical mechanism, a whole range of ways in which government control inflation. Now, this might include taxing more, but it could also mean cutting government spending or tightening financial credit regulations to reduce bank lending. And the third reason that you need to pay your taxes is it a mechanism for ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth and real resources. That is, should a government be ideologically disposed or inclined to do so. Essentially, governments make political choices about the levels of taxation, who benefits from a tax cut and who loses out. In the economic paradigm which prevails, it is often explained, and I'm sure you've heard this word or this phrase, trickle-down economics, which refers to the idea that taxes on businesses and the wealthy in society should be reduced as a means to stimulate business investment in the short term, which benefits society in the long term. And the evidence, I think, is in that that hasn't happened, and that as a result, the rich have got richer and the rest of us poorer. And fourthly and finally, it can be used as a mechanism to express public policy and drive desirable behavioural change. Now, this might mean, for example, taxing sugar to address health issues, or it could mean taxing polluting companies, or rewarding those that invest sufficiently to ensure that their production and distribution processes are environmentally friendly. It could also be taxing fuel more to encourage people to get onto public transport. But of course, as the French government discovered, unless you've actually invested heavily in improving your public transport system in rural areas, people are likely to don a few yellow jackets. So, as part of this, government forward planning and legislation is a vital part of the decision-making process, and that will be increasingly so as the climate crisis deepens. Now, the final part of this household budget jigsaw are government surpluses. This idea prevails in the public understanding of how money works. Now, we all love a surplus, don't we? I love a surplus, sounds good. Has a nice ring to it, sounds a bit responsible. But a surplus in terms of our own household accounts means savings, which might allow us, I don't know, to purchase an item that we want or pay down some debt. And most politicians will describe them as being very, very desirable. Now, we have been led to believe wrongly that the government has been financially prudent and put aside money that it has collected for a rainy day, or maybe to pay off a bit of debt. What it actually means is that a government is taxing more than it is spending. It is quite simply withdrawing money out of the economy. So what does that mean in reality? And to give an example, the 7 biggest US depressions or downturns going back 200 years were all preceded by government surpluses. Now, in the UK, Labour ran budget surpluses for 4 years, achieving the lowest deficits in UK history. And politicians at the time said that there was nothing progressive about budget deficits, and that every pound we spent on debt interest was one less we could spend on the NHS or vital public services, on helping the poor and vulnerable. Now, you need a bit of context to understand what I've just said. And that context is that the UK at the time was on the crest of a wave of consumption built on household debt, which subsequently and we know, ended in the global financial crash. That was caused by out-of-control financial institutions and governments who had not only encouraged a deregulated financial environment, but also pushed debt into the private sector, whilst claiming themselves to be financially prudent. Now, to understand this better, we can see this in pictorial form. I mean, just as a visual, what can you see about that graph? What jumps out of you? Does anything jump out at you? I'm thinking of shapes, really. Yeah, they're mirror images. So the most basic macroeconomic rule is that one person's spending equals another's income, whether it's governments or people. So economists divide the economies into three sectors: the government sector, the private sector, which includes households, businesses and financial institutions, and the foreign sector, the countries with which we trade. Now, using the, you can probably see in the early 2000s where you have the private sector going into deficit and the public sector into surplus. Now, using the rules of accounting, when the government spends more than it taxes, it runs a deficit. And that deficit in the public sector means a surplus for the private sector. So, by way of an example, if the government runs a balanced budget with its spending equal to tax revenue, the private sector's financial wealth will be zero. If the government runs continuous budget surpluses, spending less than its tax receipts, then the private sector's net financial wealth will be negative. In other words, the private sector will be indebted to the public sector. It is absolutely impossible from accounting terms for the government sector and the private sector to run surpluses at the same time. Now, when we add in the rest of the world, we can see that the three sectors all have to balance overall. Now, to give this a bit of context for the UK is a large importer of goods, and it has a really big trade deficit, or what we call a current account deficit, which matches the foreign sectors. This is all just so complicated, isn't it? Was for me the first time I looked anyway, which matches the foreign sector's surplus. So in order to compensate for the trade deficit, the government must continue to add more of its currency. Failure to do so would mean that the private sector would have to increase its level of debt by at least as much as the trade deficit, just to stand still. Also, there is another aspect to this, and that is meeting the desire of households to save. Now, we all want to save some of our income. Now, the government has to ensure that it is adding enough into the currency, into the economy, net of taxes, to ensure that it meets the needs of savers as well. So, depending on what the rest of the world is doing, if the government wants the private sector to save rather than go into debt, it will probably have to spend more than it taxes. Now, maybe you're thinking now, after hearing that deficits and debts are perhaps not the bogeyman that has been presented to us, that government has no financial constraints and cannot go bankrupt, what about that little thing called inflation? Won't spending too much lead us to a repeat of Zimbabwe, for example? Now, some economists and journalists accuse modern monetary theory economists of being far too free with the money supply without paying attention to the threat of inflation. But this is absolutely untrue. MMT economists recognise implicitly that all spending carries an inflation risk, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector. It is essential to understand that it was not the money creation in itself which created the inflation. The lesson for Zimbabwe was that if you destroy the supply side of your economy and then print loads of money, you'll push spending far beyond the productive capacity of the nation and create inflationary pressures. I don't know if you know anything about what happened in Zimbabwe, but Robert Mugabe had managed to wipe out its vital agricultural system through giving land rewards to his soldiers who were not farmers, thus driving up prices as crops failed to materialise. And there was also at the same time a very serious drought which further impacted. And this was worsened by the fact that it had also heaps of foreign debt and was facing sanctions. Now, when I was looking this up about wheelbarrows, because I kept thinking about wheelbarrows carrying all this money. And in Zimbabwe, this actually happened. They actually resorted to wheelbarrows to carry their cash. Now, in one story, a man with money stacked in his wheelbarrow was asked, "Aren't you afraid that someone will steal your cash?" And his response was, "No, I'm more worried they might steal my wheelbarrow," which actually tells us a lot about where value really lies, not in these bits of paper, but in the resources that we have. So ultimately, the risk of inflation depends on the availability of real resources. So as long as a country can mobilise the necessary real resources, which includes labour, machinery, raw materials, it can provide the public services we need without inflation. However, if it exceeds the productive capacity of the nation, inflation will likely be the consequence. And in this sense, and this is the really important bit, it is the job of government, good government, not to balance the budget, but to balance the economy. Now, I mentioned earlier that unemployment is a government choice. And this is where the job guarantee, I don't know if any of you have heard about the job guarantee, but this is where it fits into modern monetary theory. Now, in the post-war period, we had full employment, which was a policy pursued by successive governments until the mid-1970s, when neoliberal economic thought began to prevail. Currently, mainstream economists, this sounds a bit brutal, but mainstream economists claim that if a government pursues full employment policies, it will increase inflation. It is based on the belief that there is a natural rate of unemployment at which the economy is optimised. Now, they explain this through what are known as the Phillips curve and the NIRU, which stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. But basically it says that if we want to control inflation, then this is the brutal bit. We have to have millions of people unemployed, underemployed, that's key these days, or in insecure, low-paid jobs. Now, in this way, who have benefited? It's been the employers that have been benefited because they've actually been able to keep their wages costs down. But the real effect is it's left people basically abandoned on a scrap heap. Now, as an aside here, and notwithstanding that there is a lot of hidden unemployment or underemployment, which don't appear in government figures, there is an increasingly big hole in this argument, since unemployment figures are by government statistics low, and yet of inflation there is no sign at all. Now, the job guarantee provides us with another much more humane option to using people, a buffer stock of unemployed people, to control inflation. Now, this isn't a new idea. It was first suggested in 1965 by the economist Hyman Minsky. And Minsky was very well aware that capitalist systems are highly unstable and prone to debt-fueled collapse. He wrote, "Work should be available to all who want work at a national minimum wage. This should be a wage support law analogous to the price supports for agricultural products. It will replace the minimum wage law, for if work is available to all at the minimum wage, no labour will be available to private employers at a wage lower than this minimum." So the primary aim of the job guarantee will be to provide useful and meaningful employment in a public sector setting at a fixed minimum wage to anyone who wants to work but can't find a job in the private sector. It would provide for a socially inclusive wage set at a level that society thinks is reasonable and fair. It would also be a permanent programme, perhaps legislated into law, paid for at central level and managed at local level, to provide employment and training in socially useful work, basically to benefit our local communities. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in our local communities. Essentially operates as what we call a price anchor for the private sector. So if they want to employ people, they will have to offer better pay and conditions than the job guarantee. Now, whilst it gives people the dignity of work and a fair wage and working conditions and is socially inclusive, what makes this an essential part of MMT is that it's not a policy option, as is sometimes suggested. It acts as an automatic stabiliser to balance out the ups and downs of business cycle. Quite simply, a job guarantee which increases government spending stops it from sliding into recession. Equally, when the economy is booming, the job guarantee contracts as people are attracted back into private sector jobs and government spending reduces. Now, the most important thing to grasp here is that unemployment is a choice made entirely by the government of the day, and it follows that equally recessions are equally discretionary. Now, the final part of this money creation jigsaw I've left to last, which is banking, and I'm not intending to do very much on this, but this is an essential part of the money creation system. So I'm sure you know, at the top of the pyramid we have central banks. In our case it's the Bank of England, which is a nationalised institution acting on behalf of the Treasury, even though these days it is described as being independent. Now, it has a range of roles which includes managing the stability of the financial system and the economy through monetary policy, which I spoke about earlier. The government, as the sole issuer of the currency, authorises the central bank to act on its behalf. Now, it doesn't borrow cash and reserves from the private sector. To the contrary, as we've already learned, the government is the original source of cash and reserves. Although private banks and state create money, the former are dependent on the government. Their IOUs are promises to deliver the government's currency on demand to their account holder. I'm sure that, I think I thought this quite some time ago, that, when I save a bit of money in the bank, the banks lend my savings money out, and actually that's just not true. And the Bank of England confirmed that in its paper Money Creation in the Modern Economy. Banks, like governments, create money out of thin air, and indeed they do create such a lot that the economy would collapse without it. But when private banks lend, they do so under licence from the Bank of England. And there is a big difference, and it's really important to understand this difference between the government as the currency issuer, which creates net financial assets, and banks as currency users. Banks are currency users. I'm a currency user. Local government is a currency user. I don't know, we're all currency users except for the government. So bank loans create deposits. So when an asset is created by a bank, it has a corresponding liability. And when borrowers draw upon these deposits, their spending creates income, just as government spending does, and it adds to the market demand for goods and services. But the difference is all bank credit sums to zero, which means that unlike when a government creates money, savings can never come from bank loans. So we've actually come to the end of our brief foray into modern monetary realities. I really hope that it's given you at least some food for thought, because from a personal perspective, more than ever, this is a time for asking ourselves what makes a healthy economy and society. Given the climate crisis and the challenges that we are faced in righting the social injustices of the past few decades, caused by an ideology which has impoverished many, put the individual over the interests of the collective, and profit over the health of the planet and its citizens, it is surely time for us all to grasp the nettle and engage in a conversation about what we think should be our priorities in the future. I have 2 grandchildren, three grandchildren, one of 6, and one of 16, and one of 18. And this is what drives me to want to make a difference for their futures. We need to talk about what sort of country we want to be, what public and social infrastructure we want for our children's children. These are not left and right questions. These are questions about our human values. We are a nation rich in real resources and have currency issuing government with the capacity to mobilise those resources for the common good, for the public good. Now at GIMS, one of the reasons we started our organisation was because we wanted to inform people, give them the tools with which they could learn about how money really works, and offer that lens, and show the lens that it offers to governments in developing their policy options, as well as gaining an appreciation of what the real constraints are to creating a sustainable and green future. And we hope that that will provide a starting point for our discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Prue, for that excellent explanation of modern monetary theory. Bill, do we have somebody going around with the... Oh, right, Simon's going to go around with the microphone. So when you get the microphone, do just hold it nice and steady in front of your mouth, a little bit the way I'm doing now. So do we have some questions for... Okay, Toby was first of all. Toby.
Before I start, I just want to preface this by saying that my grasp on economics is really shaky, so if this question betrays the fact that I haven't understood something you said, please forgive me for that. But my question was essentially, in a situation where MMT becomes a more sort of orthodox mainstream economic system, how would a system that implemented those ideas, what would its relationship be with the private sector and how it funded initiatives? Because obviously the central government can create money ex nihilo, but private ones can't, they're currency users. And so if you've got, obviously you can fund a public service like the NHS, but things like pharmaceuticals and the equipment may come from private contractors, and if they're foreign as well, as an example, they wouldn't be subject to the same kind of spending as the central government. That wasn't entirely a question, but I hope you get what I'm trying to ask, because I'll leave it there.
I think the answer to that is, yes, I think I understand your question. MMT, as Prue said, isn't something that you apply. This is actually the way the money system works at the moment. The question is quite profoundly political, because the issue of our public services, as Prue said, this is about what resources does the government wish to purchase. I mean, that's whether that's labour, whether that's materials, whether that's the concrete and the plumbers and everything you might need to build a hospital or a house or anything else. How much of that does the government want to use? Because you've actually hit on the head of the issue. Everything that the government spends money on is something that the private sector can't use to make its businesses from. If you have a national health service that employs every single doctor in the country, and it owns every single hospital in the country, then you have no private health service. You may have a very small one. Traditionally, we used to talk about Harley Street, because the private sector in health was so small in this country that we literally referred to it by a street. I mean, it wasn't quite literally that, but that's how we thought of it. The private sector is now much, much increased, because the public sector has decreased. The amount of the resources that the public sector is buying is smaller, and that's a political issue. Whether you wish to allow the private sector to have that power to run those services or to offer those services alternately. And it is an argument that can be put. I mean, that really is the real argument. When you say that when you understand that MMT says the government has the power to spend all the money it wishes to, and that could be in some Stalinist future where they literally buy every single resource in the country. I mean, it could be anything you like. And it could also be a very laissez-faire one in which the private sector do everything they like. But it's the government's choices to make that. And I think that to me is one of the big issues, because I'm an NHS campaigner and a public service campaigner, as well as being obviously a proponent of MMT, is that once you understand that the government is not limited by its money, but is limited by the resources in the country, then the argument becomes very, very specifically, what portion of our resources do we wish the government to be able to purchase to use, and what do we want the private sector to use? And if you had a government that had to make its arguments on that basis, then you would be offered a very different kind of argument from one that says, how are you going to pay for it? Does that answer your question?
If you can be fairly quick, so we'll try and get some more questions in. Yeah. Okay, yeah, let's move on. John has got a question, just here, Simon, and Chris.
Thank you. I'd like to understand why MMT don't advocate actual monetary financing of government, rather than just pretending that that's what already happens. The notion that either the Treasury or the Bank of England just spends money into existence is ridiculous. It's against all business public accountability norms. I thought you'd bring something a bit more sophisticated to grown finance. I know that's the kind of meme that's encouraged amongst the MMT faculty. You should know that that most nations' governments are legally forbidden from money creation. For governments in the EU, with one exception, that would be by Lisbon Article 133, which forbids government overdrafts from the central bank. It also forbids direct monetisation of bonds by the central bank. So, why not? I found out only last night actually that the UK is exempt from Lisbon Article 123 and it is permitted to use the Ways and Means facility to take a deficit of the central bank and use monetary finance, but it's not done. Why would you not advocate for that rather than spread these ridiculous means?
Thank you, John. Sorry, the PA was a little bit fuzzy there, but who's going to try that one?
I have to say that I think that being, what should I say, personally insulting doesn't help your argument. We're here, I think, to discuss and debate things. I did A-level economics in the early 70s. Taught that under a Keynesian, as what was then the Keynesian rules, and understood always from a very early age of the government as being the currency originator and the currency issuer, and therefore the only ones ultimately who can decide where the money goes and what happens to it. Now, if you have a series of accounting rules that have been agreed for whatever reasons, and I would argue that those reasons are largely political rather than anything else, that restricts the amount of money that a government can spend and says that they are not allowed to do this, then those are simply conventions. They're not actually anything to do with the real power of the currency issuing government. So if the government decides that, or governments, let's say the governments collectively in the EU decide that no one is allowed to run a deficit that exceeds 3% of GDP, which is what in fact they've done under the Sustainability and Growth Pact, that's a convention, it's an agreement, it's not a real constraint on a sovereign currency issuing nation. And I would say, as I've just said, this is a largely political argument, because this argument is about what do you want the government to be able to spend on and what do you not want it to be able to spend on. So all of those arguments, and actually since we're speaking to Dorset Humanists, and since I myself am an atheist and a humanist, let me put this into a certain context for you. God is a construct, and its priests are the people who protect that construct and who put the people of the country under the rules and regulations of that construct. And I would like you to imagine money in that same terms. Money is a construct. It has no real value in terms of being intrinsically a thing in itself, even though we all want so much of it all the time. Its purpose and its value is only in relation to the real resources of the country. If your country has nothing, it doesn't matter how much money you produce, you're still going to be hungry. And if your country has an excess of goods and services, as ours does, and we allow people to go hungry for the want of giving them the money that they need from whatever, whether that's through employing enough people in public service or whatever other kinds of means that we might choose to do it, then that is also something that is being done by the economic priesthood. The people who are guardians of this who will tell you about wonderful equations that will show you about how we will become bankrupt. 300 years of running deficits, this country has never been bankrupt, and we have run much larger deficits than we do at the moment. We also, as Prue has explained, run surpluses which have led to economic crises. So this thing that's supposed to be so good is so wonderful. If you save, you the gentleman there in the front row, if you save, you're a really good saver, and everyone goes, oh, he's really brilliant, he always saves a certain amount of his money out of his income, it's really fantastic. We should all do that, and we all started to do it. What actually happens to the country is that you are stopping the income that we all have being used to pay for the goods and services that we need to keep the economy circulating. That's the practicality of money. It buys the goods and services that keeps the economy circulating. And the same thing happens with the government. Government spends, it is doing its job in helping keeping the money circulating, buying the goods and services, keeping the economy healthy. If you have an artificial construct that says, this God is so valuable, this God is so precious, so absolutely, totally sacred, that we must not let it be spent more than a certain amount, this 3%, this precious limitation, then what you are doing is depriving people of the ability and the means to live. That's reality. So that's really what this is about. And and that's why it is a profoundly political question. And it's, as Prue also said, not a matter of left or right, because your choices are your choices, and we would like those choices to be clear. So actually, no, I reject the slur that we are not addressing an adult audience here. I think that we are addressing an audience with a far more developed and thoughtful approach to how we use money than one that just says, how are you going to pay for it, when we know full well it can be paid for.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. We're running short of time, so Chris wants to ask a question. The gentleman in the front who you pointed to. I hope the...
Testing.
Sounds a bit better, yeah.
My question is, so which party should we pick? Which party has the best economic policies?
I don't think we'll be telling you that.
I actually can't tell you that, and the reason I can't tell you is because we have a Conservative Party that says that we can't afford to spend, and a Labour Party that says, Jeremy Corbyn said the other day, if we do not collect the money from the rich and the powerful, then we won't have any money to spend on public services. So I think probably you have to vote the way that you believe money should be spent in the country, perhaps, rather than, and that will be your own personal choice. And that whatever that is, that you should then work like Billio to start actually combating the argument that the country has no money, that it can't afford it, and that it's not allowed to spend money. I think that would be the big thing to do, because that would change the political debate and the economic debate more than anything else, possibly more than any vote that's going to go into a box this time.
Okay, I think we'll just have one more. So, Aaron, if you'd like to...
Thank you. Okay, I'm no expert in economics, but I do understand a pie chart, and when we raise 700 billion, we should spend 700 billion in my view. If we don't, it gives us a debt, which gives us a deficit, which means we have to pay the debt, as far as I'm aware of it. So why don't we just wipe off the debt and just say, well, we don't have to pay that? Or is that too simplistic?
Have you got, actually, can I gather...
A flip chart you need, I think.
Can I gather up a few pieces of paper? You know these pieces of paper, you've got the ones that leave, and the ones that left on the chair, isn't it? Yeah, okay. The ones that left back, okay. Are you ready to give me some of these? Give me some of these. Lovely. Okay. Here we are.
Okay.
I am a commercial bank. Okay? I think I can probably, tell me if you can't hear. I'm a commercial bank, right? And you're going to come and ask me for some money, right? Okay? Because you want to buy something, whatever, it's a loan. And it's going to be 3 Deborah pounds, right? The loan that you need, okay? Here I'm going to give you 3 Deborah pounds, right? Okay? That's your money, your loan from the bank. I would like some interest from you, please. I would like you to pay me back now 5 Deborah pounds.
Well, here's 3, and I'll owe you the other couple, because I haven't got them.
Where are you going to get them from?
Who knows?
Yeah.
True.
Now, I'm going to the government. And this is what I'm going to do as the government. You are a government supplier. You make MRI machines for the NHS. Okay? I am going to buy an MRI machine from you for 5 Deborah pounds. I'll take that. Oh, the tax I'd like 3 Deborah pounds back, please.
Okay.
Guess what? You've now got your 2 Deborah pounds that you need to pay your bank loan. The government pays net money into the economy when it runs a deficit. Commercial banks take money away from you. Where is the money going to be in the economy if the government isn't happily adding up with the supposed debt, which, as Prue explains, is the total of all the deficits that are run year on year? If they're not saying, whoops, okay, everything's getting a bit more expensive, we need to put a bit more money into the economy. They pay it in the economy, they take back premium tax, less than they pay in. They are giving you money to spend. That's what the government does when it runs a deficit. It is giving you money to spend. That's how it works. Right, so, now, do you want the government to be having £700 billion in tax and only spending £700 billion? Or would you rather have some of those billions of pounds landing in your bank accounts for you to be able to use? That's really the kind of the bottom line, the very most simplistic bottom line of it. Yeah.
One quick rejoinder then, yes.
Okay.
I still worry that if the deficit grows, we then don't have that money. So, for example, a chunk the size of the defence budget is taken out of our pie chart, and we don't usually replace that with deficit. So it's lost money, which means then we have to have cuts, unless the debt is wiped off or the deficit is reduced.
In 1945, after the war, there was a huge spending programme began on the NHS, on housing, and as Prue said, we had a national debt of 249%. We never paid that down, and yet now we've only got a national debt of 87%. So how come we've only got
86.
86%. How come we've only got a national debt of 86%? In relation to our GDP, compared with that. How has that happened?
Money devalued?
No, money doesn't devalue, the economy grows.
The Americans wrote a lot off.
Sorry?
The Americans wrote a lot off.
The Americans, the amount of money
massive amounts to America and they wrote them off.
When your economy grows, I mean, if you look at the total economy in 1945, it was something like, I don't know, it was something really tiny. It was a few billion. Now it's over 2 trillion.
So the percentage is completely irrelevant.
So when you're talking about writing, the debt hasn't been substantially written off. The only time that we substantially, because what that means is taking the government bonds and instead of reissuing new ones when they come to an end, the government actually just retires them, just ends it, just pays them off and ends them. That's how we pay down debt, is by paying off government bonds. The only time that's happened in any really serious amount was in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher sold so many of our nationalised industries, and the cash and literally took the money from that. And Harold Macmillan, who was a previous Tory Prime Minister, said, the one thing that you never do is to sell your assets. You don't sell the family silver, was his phrase. Because once you actually start saying, I'm going to sell my house to pay my debts, then you have a worse problem, because you've then got no house to live in. And so that's a household analogy, but if you extend it to the country, if you start selling off your hospital, if you start closing down your schools, then your future is no longer calculated in terms of this debt that you need to repay, but the fact that you no longer have the actual furniture and infrastructure in the country to be able to provide the services that you need to your people.
Deborah and Prue, I'm sorry we've run out of time now. I'm going to give people a break. We have got some time after the break. We've got our part 2 meeting, so you're very welcome to come back I don't know if Prue and Deborah, they may have to catch their train back to London, but I've just read a textbook on MMT. I'm very happy to continue the conversation. So for now, will you please give Deborah and Prue a big round of applause?